Welcome to the new episode of Unfiltered Solopreneur. I'm Nikhil Vaish, your host, founder and CEO of BoostSolo. I'm really excited to have with me today a force of nature who's traded the courtroom for the boardroom with a passion for empowering women to shatter glass ceilings. Brittany Hale, welcome to the show.
Nikhil, that is probably the best introduction I've had on any podcast thus far. So thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, your resume is where I got it, so I think. But so let's dive in. You have a really interesting background. That you've taken some twists and turns, and I think people would love to hear about your story. So let me start out by asking you. You transitioned from a legal and public service career to founding a consulting company. So what motivated you to make that shift? And maybe also tell us, how did your experience in law and public service prepare you for the challenges of entrepreneurship?
Absolutely. So I would say curiosity and a deep, deep desire for efficiency facilitated that shift. I served as an elected official. I served as an attorney. And the most challenging part about being an attorney, especially being a trial attorney, is that no one wants to speak to you until the poorly made decisions have already been made.
Right.
Very rarely do you have leaders come in and say, I think I'm going to do this thing. Can I do this? And so over time, as I began litigating cases, have you ever had jury duty?
I recently had my first call at jury duty, and I have to say I loved it. I don't know why people complain.
I rarely get that. Most people say I absolutely didn't love it. But for listeners, most cases, from my perspective, are won or lost based on jury selection. And that is each side, of the attorneys both have the opportunity to select jurors that they think will be most receptive to the facts of the case that they're presenting on behalf of their client.
Right.
And you really have to make these educated guesses, right? You kind of have to, we often hear about bias in a negative perspective, but it's really what you're doing, right? You're using your bias to make snap judgments about people, how they will interact with you, your client, and one another, and whether or not you'll be successful in presenting facts. And so you have to get really great at closing the gap between what a potential juror says and how they operate. So Nikhil, I'm sure for you, maybe you would make a face, maybe you would look up and say, does this make sense? Maybe you had the opportunity to take notes, and the attorneys were watching you like a hawk to figure out whether or not you were amenable to their clients' arguments.
Right.
Over time, I realized most organizations are just scaled out juries. There's always this gap between what they say and how they operate. The only difference is it's not a matter of one case being won or lost or, money. It's really the loss of time, talent, and most importantly, trust.
Right.
And so I looked around and I said, I see this regardless of the market, regardless of the industry. You see this inability for leaders to make informed decisions that are based on a consistent framework for decision making that is both reliable, accessible, and rational. And so I got really curious, and that's what led me into strategic advisement.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like you're saying because in the legal space, people come to you after they've made a mess, right?
Correct.
And it's too late to fix it. Whereas
Correct.
You figured in the corporate space, you could sort of go in and make sure they don't end up down that road before they even get to a courtroom, right?
Absolutely. And I would say, you ask, what I've borrowed from public service and from my time as an attorney. And I have to say, the curiosity and the desire to be solution oriented. most people are either really passionate about politics or really apathetic. And it's really because we want solutions and we just differ on the way that we believe we should go about getting the answer to the problems that we're facing. And so
Yeah.
that happens in the courtroom. That happened when I was running for office. So I served as president of my city's Board of Education. And the issue facing the residents in my city was that property owners were being overtaxed, meaning their property taxes were really high. And at the same time, the city was not receiving the adequate budget that they should have been receiving from the state. So every year the state would have a budget and say, okay, this is how much we're apportioning to this city's school district. Well,
Right.
we weren't receiving that. And so taxpayers ended up, having to make up the difference. And so again, people are facing a problem. People differ on what the solution looks like. In consulting, curiosity is my best friend because I drop into this organization and people will say, we're experiencing this problem, right? We have high levels of turnover, attrition's really high. People are cycling out, or, we can't really get what we would like out of our team, right? We have leaders that are making decisions that might be expensive. We don't have high trust. You look on Glassdoor, our reviews are terrible. And so then there's a lack of consensus on how best to navigate some of these complex changes that these organizations are facing. And as you know, you can have one organization and many different cultures within that organization.
Sure.
So my job is to come in to assess that and then to develop strategies that align both leadership and the teams that they're leading with the organization's broader goals.
So it sounds like there are quite a few skills that are translatable from your legal and your public service, right? I mean, in terms of consensus building, identifying the problem, building. I mean, and also just the efficiency that you talked about earlier, because I mean, law is very much more black and white, right? So,
law is very gray.
oh, fair enough.
But,
Okay.
Because there's so much nuance. So we in the United States, we rely on a system whereby what's been decided before informs our understanding of and our interpretation of the facts that we're presented with now. And so there's a lot of nuance there, right? So we will know, for example, that it is, the offensive hitting of another person is what we will commonly think of as a battery, right? Someone pushes you in the line. Okay, they may have committed a battery. But what happens if they were having a seizure that they didn't expect? What if someone pushed them? What if they were knocked to the side by, a runaway golf cart, and that golf cart propelled them into pushing you and thus injured you, right? So we have all of these really intricate situations, and we have the law to rely upon, but there's tons of room for interpretation. Similarly, we will say, okay, an organization, what's the point of this business? Well, we want to be profitable.
Right.
Awesome. Show me the practices, the systems and processes that you're employing to become profitable. And every business has a different interpretation of what that looks like. Show me what your, the dreaded C word, right? Culture. What does that look like? And how is that substantive? How is this boosting your organization's competitive edge?
Right.
To say, oh, great. Well, we have beer on tap. We have a meditation room. We have, on-site dry cleaning. From a financial perspective, I may have an opinion about it, but ostensibly it should be in furtherance of our ultimate goal, which is to be profitable, to increase market share, and to deliver solutions to a broader segment of the market that we're trying to solve for.
Right. Yeah, no, and you have to sort of bring all those, well, you have to make sure they make sense and they serve the bigger goal, right? Rather than just sort of
Exactly.
checking boxes, which I think happens a lot of times. So
Absolutely.
we talked about the fact that it seems like a lot of skills transferred or were
Yes.
transferable into your new profession. And I love how you sort of framed it. So what were some of the biggest challenges you encountered during the transition? Because, you moved from a very structured world to a pretty unstructured world.
Absolutely. I'd say the greatest challenge was an expansion of the understanding of my skill set, right? Because people saw me and said, okay, you're a lawyer. We'll call you if we have a compliance issue. We'll call you if we need of counsel. We'll call you if we get in trouble. And
Okay.
again, hearkening back to what I value, that efficiency piece is the opportunity to say, hey, I understand what it looks like. When you are in the process of, before you land in the courtroom, there's a whole process called discovery. And part of discovery is a deposition, which is a question and answer session taken under oath. And that is really an opportunity to work backwards to say, how did we get here?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Tell us the narrative. Help me understand why we're at odds to the point that we need to be in litigation. And so from my perspective, it was much more efficient, given that knowledge I had, to say, hey, I can help you lay out a strategy for your leaders that is both going to empower your leaders and create a space where your leaders have the requisite skill set and agency to further the organization's goals, while also deeply understanding the needs of their teams.
Right.
And we often see that there are leaders who may be facing pressure from the C-suite or from their boards. And without being adequately prepared for leadership, they're relying on their own internal decision-making, which may or may not be aligned with the organization's broader goals, the organization's processes, or even what the founder had in mind. Right? I'm sure we've both seen people make some really wacky decisions under pressure. But when we peel back and say, how did we get here? We see so many entry points. So my greatest challenge was to say, I'm not just the person you employ when you've been served.
Right.
Right. I'm there to make sure I am really a preventative agent for you to not have to be there in the first place.
Yeah.
And that for me was, again, the challenge.
Right. And you touched on something interesting, which we'll come back to, which is you had to rebrand yourself too, right? Because
Absolutely.
people saw you a certain way. So we'll talk about that. The other thing that was really interesting is that, when I go in and solve a brand problem, it's the same thing. I always say I go in and first redefine the problem through the discovery, because very often you're not asking the right question. So how do we get to the problem is far more important than what people think the problem is, right? So
correct.
I think that's a really valuable lesson for anybody, even for solopreneurs. So now let me ask you, just sort of digging beneath the surface now. So you have a very impressive profile on LinkedIn. You have a lot of accomplishments. Can you talk about a personal challenge or setback that you faced that isn't on your resume and how it shaped your journey as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I faced was during my freshman year of college. And I was on campus living the stereotypical first year life. And spring semester, early in the semester, I developed a severe allergic reaction that landed me in a children's hospital at the time, because I started college when I was 7. I wasn't 18 yet, so I was in a children's hospital for about a month and a half.
Wow.
And during my spring semester, I had to withdraw and spend pretty much the entirety of that semester recovering from this really odd, really wacky completely random allergy that I developed while living on campus. And that was really tough because, fall semester, you're getting the swing of things, you're making friends, you're in a space where you're learning yourself in college and really just beginning your college career. And spring, I think, of course, I live in the Northeast, so you expect to have fun going into the summer, exploring internships. And so it was really disruptive and challenging for me to have to refocus on something that I'd always taken for granted, which was, of course, was my health.
Yeah, that is, and everything's okay now. Since then, you've been great.
Everything is great. I was able to graduate on time, and I spent, I have to say, my professors were so understanding, so incredible. I have so much scarlet pride. I am a Rutgers University, Newark Honors College alum, and it really took time for me that summer. I had to go back and take the finals for the courses that I would have taken in, summer was spent recovering and studying and preparing to re-enroll in the fall. So it was a huge challenge. Looking back, I'm quite grateful, especially, of course, now to be healthy, but more to the point, because that was really an opportunity for me to test my own resilience, right? Test my grit to see how I would respond when faced with adversity.
Yeah, and that's a lot of adversity. And so you use it as fuel, it sounds like. Because
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. That for me was an invitation to realize that there's more than one way to do things. And sometimes you have to deviate from the script, right? Sometimes you're going to be presented with plot twists, but it doesn't have to completely throw you off of the track. Or sometimes those plot twists are going to be the exact thing that leads you on your journey. Of course, me deciding to step away from litigation, right? Much to my parents' chagrin, my parents, oh my gosh, you're starting a business? You could be a judge. What are you doing? And it required that internal trust in myself and that belief in my own inner resilience to know that regardless of the circumstances that I was presented with, I was going to be more than fine. And that it was important for me to live my purpose as I believed it to be, not necessarily the prescriptive version of what that looked like.
So can I ask you, is anyone in your family an entrepreneur, or are you the first?
My father was an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
and he had a business for a few years. And so I watched him. And the thing that he told me, again, he's a retired Marine and a fire chief. And so again, there's this element of service that was pervasive throughout our household. And, he's always said, talent is maybe equally distributed. Opportunities aren't. But again, if you know how to work, no one can beat you. And he really emphasized being savvy, being strategic, and whatever it is, whatever you want to do, on the whole, strive to be the best at it, right? And I think we may have that maybe have that in common, but that for me was the invitation. Now I think for him, he knew that I had the self-discipline and the ability to get up and just go do what I needed to do. I think he thought that might come much later. And I think he thought that would come as, I'll start my own law firm. I don't think he said you'll start a strategic advisory firm, but here we are.
But I love how you translated the skills, because they're like, you've taken your strengths and moved it into the next phase, right? And I
Absolutely.
probably made him very happy. You did public service and entrepreneurship, right? Two things that he was passionate about. So
Exactly.
so,
Exactly.
You talked about, there are a bunch of things you talked about in terms of, being able to the focus and sort of being able to move forward and do things. But entrepreneurship is also a lonely journey, right? So
Mhm.
especially now, I also left a corporate background. You have colleagues, you have friends, you have people to fall back on, you have,
Right.
but as a solopreneur, as an entrepreneur, you're pretty much on your own. And very often you're sort of in your own head. And so how do you handle that isolation? And what advice do you have for solopreneurs who might be facing the same thing?
So one of my challenges to myself has always been to turn what I was afraid of or my perceived weaknesses into strengths. And I completely agree with you. Entrepreneurship is so lonely. But you know what else is lonely is leadership.
True.
It is for the both of them, you can say it's a blessing and a burden when it is all your fault. When things are going right, when the business succeeds, when the team does well, you're a superstar. And when the plot twists come, when your runway looks a little bit different than it did last month, or your financial projections look a bit shaky, it's frightening, right? Because all you have is you.
True.
And so I've thought about, again, I always ask people, especially my clients that are leaders, who were you when you had to do a team project? 93% of the time, they were the people that said, give me the work, I'll do it. And then, you guys can just put your name on it. But they didn't trust in others. And so
Right.
it was really revealed to me through my work with these leaders about how important it was to build connections. And for me, I realized that most of my friends, I had to kind of do a friend audit, right? To see that I needed people who knew what I was going through. I needed people because, Nikhil, when you say, I don't know if you've ever had family or friends say, oh, what time are you done work? And you're like, it's never really done, right? We're never really finished.
Yeah.
It's when I'm tired of thinking about this problem, or, when my I'm just physically exhausted. And so I knew that it was going to be on me. I had to erect boundaries around my work, and I had to connect with other people who knew what the journey was like, but also knew that relationship building and balance was going to be the key to that success.
Yeah, that's really important and good advice, because you're right. There are no lines, right? I mean, in the corporate
Mhm.
world, you can burn out on someone else's dime, but here there are absolutely no boundaries. You have to set your own. So I totally
Yeah,
agree with that. So I want to go back and touch on something you talked about, because I'm a brand builder, so that interests me.
sure.
But you talked about how you sort of got boxed into, when you started, people saw you as what you were before, which is legal, which is after the trouble has started, right? Now,
Right.
you also have a diverse background. You're an attorney, former elected official, now you're a business strategist. So, how did you sort of bring these different roles together and create a cohesive brand?
Absolutely. So when I scoped out, what am I really great at? Because if you look at my background, I'm a multi hyphenate. Right? I started my business because someone asked me a question in salsa class.
Wow. Okay.
Okay. I lectured at Columbia for a semester because of an Instagram reel that I posted on LinkedIn that resonated with people. So I'd also had a lot of difficulty articulating my strengths, but I realized that I that ability to be a Swiss Army knife, right? To be mutable, to be someone that is a multi hyphenate, to borrow from all of these different experiences that most people can't hold at one time, was going to be my greatest asset, because I am able to, every position I've had has had the commonality of education and advocacy, and my ability to see problems and develop unique solutions that have not previously been engaged with. And so I thought about that, and I said, okay, well, how do I get people to expand past what they know of or believe about an attorney, which is, these kind of either this super boisterous, kind of salesy, inauthentic person who's yelling all the time, right? You can't handle the truth. Or they're this super bookish, transactional, cold person.
Right.
So when I thought about developing the brand, first is I pulled the people who are around me, right? What do you think I do? What do you think I'm good at? How do you perceive me? And unquestioningly, it was, you're the person that asks the questions that no one asks or they're afraid to ask.
Right.
And so I sat back and I was reading a book, and I came across this poem by Alice Walker, and it started off with "Be Nobody's Darling." And the poem speaks about really kind of embracing all of the things that make you different, using them to keep yourself enriched. And I said, that's exactly it. That's exactly what I focus on. Is I'm there to shine light on the dark corners, but also develop solutions in a way that's authentic to the person I'm working with. I don't need people to fit a mold that's going to hack away at the pieces that made them unique in the first place. And so that's where I came up with B&D Consulting. And it also informed my framework, which is, of course, belief, navigation, and discipline, right? How do we establish what success looks like for you? How do we navigate and, charter through some of these complex positions, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't just set a strategy and say, okay, that'll be great. See you in a few years. Inevitably, those plot twists come up.
Right.
And then how do we diligently establish discipline so that you're developing a new muscle that you can rely on? So even though, I'm a part with my clients, we've developed that muscle enough that they can keep it somewhere up there and move forward.
That's great. And that's really good advice too, because most people think they have to sort of figure it out themselves. I love that you went and asked people who know you better than,
Right.
most to give you your strengths. So I want to touch on another thing that you do, which is you empower female leaders, right? So what
Yes.
sparked your passion for this, and what are some of the most common challenges women face when building their strategic vision in the business world today?
Yeah. So when I looked around, and of course, when you start off, you're gonna work with whoever, right? But
Sure.
eventually, I had the opportunity to really kind of niche down and say, who needs my help? And I looked at various industries and I looked at the data presented, and I've seen that within the past few years, women are leaving leadership faster than women are being promoted into these roles. And so I said, okay, that's interesting. Why is that happening? Because I know that these people are really, it's not for lack of competence, right? We know that women are outnumbering men in higher education. So how is it that these people are going to school, they're graduating, right? They're demonstrating an exuberant and enthusiastic fervor for whatever their subject matter is, but they don't really seem to be leading innovation.
Right.
And it's when I realized that two things were happening. One, there was a lack of clarity in what they wanted to achieve. First, there's this question around why are you in this particular space, right? And if you're a leader who's leaving, or if you've been in the space for a while and you've not assumed a position of leadership, well, why is that?
Right.
And then I happened upon the issue of confidence. And so I looked at the research, and we see that these women, despite being subject matter experts, experience a crisis of confidence when it comes to leading other people.
Right.
Because the examples of leadership seem completely at odds with the way that they've been socialized and some of the skills that they've not been able to turn into strategic strengths, right? Some of these soft skills that we've heard about are actually the strategic strengths that can increase an organization's bottom line. Okay, so the ability to lean into the EQ, right? The emotional intelligence, to build consensus, to build collaboration, to have statistically tend to be higher verbal skills, but also listening comprehension, right? To get to the heart of not only what you hear, but what the underlying need is, what's actually being said, what's actually being communicated. And so then I said, well, there it is. How can I teach women to make the strategic decisions that will help them excel in their roles and also boost the organization's competitive edge? Because the exclusion has to have a legitimate business purpose.
Right.
At least the way that I see it. What is the purpose of the exclusion? If it's just, you want to be comfortable, that's not sufficient. Right? We have to move past comfort. And so yeah, that's how I ended up focusing on women.
I think that's awesome. And I actually personally, in my experience, I think women do make better leaders than men, especially in like times of crisis.
Yeah.
You're right. They have skills that men just don't. The way I put it down to is the problem with most male leaders is ego. They cannot get past their ego, right? So, but anyway, that's a different podcast. So let me ask you now. Let me ask you about what excites you most about the future of B&D Consulting, and are there any sort of big risks or bold moves on the horizon?
Yeah. So what excites me most is scaling. And so I've been working to develop, again, both having taught at the adult level and facilitated as such. I'm really, really fascinated with the way that adults learn. And so building out these adult learning design processes is something that I'm really looking forward to in the coming months. Developing a few different packages that are going to allow for repeated critical engagement through multiple modalities. It's not enough. I'm happy to come and speak at people for 90 minutes, but I need to make sure that it's sinking in.
Yeah.
And that people will walk away. I've had my clients say, "Oh, we use these Brittanyisms, right? Or we've adopted these Brittany, and the way that we host meetings are completely different. The way that we're engaging with one another is completely different." And so my thought is, how can I scale that out? And so it's expanding upon these assets that allows for asynchronous engagement. Given that I've not yet successfully been able to clone myself.
Yeah, no, I love that. So it's what you talked about earlier, which is muscle building, right? Because
Exactly.
it takes time to build that muscle. And also I love another thing that I love is that you're creating self-sufficiency rather than dependency, right? Because I know a lot of consultants try and come in and create dependency for the long-term gravy train. And, I'd never aspired to that, but I love that.
Yeah.
And so while your business growth, I know, is important, but what's the larger impact you hope to leave in the world with the work you're doing with women leaders?
The larger impact I would hope to lead, and this comes from, when I look through it, I said, okay, I want to amplify positive impact within the world of work. But I'd worked with an amazing sales coach at the time who challenged my own belief in what I could do. And she said, I never make a decision without first creating all the options. And my goal through B&D, my challenge to my clients is to be nobody's darling. Let's take what it is, your authenticity is, your distinct competitive advantage, and let's create as many options as necessary or as possible for you to be able to advance the organization and advance yourself. And let's redefine the face of leadership. I'm really excited for that.
That's great, and it's a great legacy to leave behind. And so, let me ask you now: if you could offer one piece of advice to someone who's wanting to start their solopreneur entrepreneurial journey, what would you say to them?
Do not shy away from the hard questions. When we employ design thinking, right? Like one of the preeminent questions, the foundational questions that you have to ask is why.
Right.
And it takes courage, especially in spaces. If you're in a remote space, right? Your stomach might drop before you take yourself off of mute in a Zoom room, but your question is important. Right? We don't want to sacrifice you know, a product, a service, a brand. We don't want to sacrifice professional integrity for the sake of speed.
True.
So my question, my challenge is always have the courage to be curious. What happens if you ask the question versus what happens if you leave it unsaid?
True. And you're right. And that's off yourself too, right? I would imagine. And the people you
Absolutely.
work with. Yeah. Goes both ways. That's great advice. So Brittany, is there anything else you'd like to share that we haven't covered for our listeners?
I would say I would just invite listeners, even the men who are listening, right? If for the men who said tuned out and said, she only works with women, I'm throwing this away. Not necessarily true. If you resonate with the mission, if you are a subject matter expert who is leading a team of women, or you have women on your team, have the courage to be curious enough to say, is there a better way that I can lead? Am I solely leaning on the example set before me? And what opportunities are there to improve, to innovate? And get curious.
Yeah, I love that.
And call me.
I'm waiting to see if you'd add that. I think
Give
that's
me a
great.
call,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 'Cause I sometimes I think men need more help, but that's again another podcast. But okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I love to end with a little rapid fire round. So I'm just going to throw a couple of questions at you. Whatever
I'm
comes to your
excited.
mind, just give me the answer.
Sure.
Uh, okay. So you ready to go? All right.
I'm ready to go.
Okay. So if your career transitions were a book title, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great one. Um, Curiouser and Curiouser. Immediately, Alice in Wonderland came to mind. So I think that would be it.
That matches. So now I'm going to throw you a legal one, which is not quite a legal question, but if your entrepreneurial journey was a court case, what would be the verdict and why?
Oh, I think I'm still fighting. I don't
Okay.
think we're done yet.
Yeah, I think you're just getting started.
Yeah,
If you
we're at
could
opening statements.
absolutely. If you could give a TED talk tomorrow on any subject outside of your current expertise, what would it be on?
It would be on the cultural anthropological value of reality TV.
I,
I,
I
I can make a case for it. We learn a lot about ourselves by the way that we engage with reality
I
television.
would renew my TED membership to watch that one. What's one specific habit or practice you believe every solopreneur or entrepreneur should adapt based on your experience?
Have a pat yourself on the back email draft. It is so easy to look around, to scroll, to look through social media channels, and you see everyone else's wins and you feel so defeated. Or you may just say, oh my gosh, this person had a 6 or 7 month or a 6-figure, 7-figure month. I'm struggling to make that in a year. It's very true that comparison is the thief of joy. And so it's important for you to keep track of those wins. Every time you make your first sale, note that down. You're building, this really is the anatomy of your legacy. You're building that legacy. So don't lose track of how far you've come.
A bank of back pats. I love that because
Yes.
you need that when
That's
you're on
great.
your own.
Absolutely.
What's the most unexpected lesson you've learned from working with women leaders?
You can never over communicate. There are so many things, so many opportunities that I've had, both in my own leadership journey and working with leaders, where I've assumed that we were speaking the same language. I assumed that we had the same perspective, and we just didn't. So I assumed nothing. I overstayed everything.
Again, good advice. Well, Brittany, it's been a real pleasure, and I love all the advice you've shared. I think it's really going to be really valuable to anybody wanting to embark on their solopreneur entrepreneur journey or already on it. So thank you so much for your time and all your great wisdom.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.